it's interesting to see that there is a lot of support on a policy level for nature-based solutions, but there seems to be kind of the reoccurring theme of funding. Obviously, us coming from the SARCC project background, we've been very fortunate that we got the European Union's funding through Interreg, which enabled us to do pilot projects, to study the nature-based solutions, and try to help mainstreaming them. But this funding is not always available, and especially when nature-based solutions will scale up, of course, they will not be, those kind of funding streams won't be there. So the money, Michael touched upon it a little bit, maybe we need to get banks involved, maybe we need to get private capital involved, and John earlier on as well mentioned that the support is there, but the funding is a problem. So I would like to introduce our next speaker, Heather, who's going to talk about just that, about the funding, about the challenges with the funding, and perhaps what we can do to move forward. Maybe I'll just quickly go to that. Brilliant. So Heather is a honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of Architects, and she's also a co-founder of Biodiversity Capital. So she's well versed in the funding of nature-based solutions. Hopefully, you will give us some positive news about options. But yes, over to you, Heather.
Well, thank you very much, and it's very exciting to be in the room with you today. I'm Chief Executive of Thames Estuary Partnership, and my technical director, or our technical director, is going to be speaking tomorrow about some of our habitat creation projects and some of the other projects we're involved with. So Thames Estuary Partnership is well represented. Also, I've got my other co-founder of Biodiversity Capital, who's Yurema Ranish, who's taking pictures at the moment. So if there's anything really complicated that you need to ask me about some of the concepts around funding that I'm going to be talking about today, he'll be available during the panel discussion as well. I'm also a trustee of Access, which is the Foundation for Social Investment. And this is a program that brings together blended finance, different partners who come from different pots of funding to fund social enterprises. So I mention those because they're relevant, and just to say that the Thames Estuary Partnership is a very long-standing partnership of 20-something years of the main parties and agencies who are responsible for estuarine and coastal management. So first of all, I've been asked to talk about funding. I'm not going to talk about grant funding. I'm going to talk about something very specific, which is investing in nature-based solutions. And the good news is there are investors who want to invest in nature-based solutions. The bad news is it's complicated, like everything. And I am going to talk about, and the other thing that's challenging and a little bit frustrating is it's so incredible to be in an international audience. The models I'm going to be talking about are very much UK based. So what I hope is there's a future to talk about expanding that, but very much based on the projects that you're leading, talk about the pilot projects, and then see if we can actually connect investors to nature-based solution projects. I'm very much going to be talking about some concepts. I'm hoping that my set of slides, of which I have created too many for today, my 15-minute slot, will provide some resources for you. So if you're interested in the topic, if you're interested in that, you'll use that. You'll look at some of the different institutions that I'm talking about if you want to familiarize yourself. So I'm just going to touch on some basic concepts and some initiatives that are happening at the moment. This is very much a conversation about a journey between the project delivery. I come from a project delivery background myself, and the frustration of meeting the people who have the money. There's about $1 trillion that's locked up in private capital. It's trying to kind of get to the projects that we're doing now where people actually really care, and there seems to be a number of segments that are missing. So what's really encouraging to me is to hear Michael talk about this is actually, you know, something that's very much as part of the COP27 conversation. We just have to get there faster, and we have to be able to connect the dots in a logical way. And there are people who are trying to do that. So I'm just going to talk about in sort of my space, in our space in the UK, where there's been conversations and a number of conferences. I'm going to be talking about the Impact Investing Institute, the Green Finance Institute, who very much sit on the financial institution, the financial ecosystem services side. They had a paper that they launched that came out of the G7 task force on the 18th of July called Time to Deliver. It's very much about trying to get away from talking about our objectives and actually delivering against them and getting partners together to deliver. And also one that we, Thames Estuary Partnership, and our partner, the City of London Corporation, we ran in October, which is bringing leaders together to talk about the complexities of nature recovery and how we're actually going to fund those projects. And the one very specific one, which is the actual opportunity, was a Natural Capital Finance Investment Conference that also happened on the 17th of October and the 1st of November. And I'm going to be talking about the partners there who want, in the next year, to be able to invest in nature-based solution projects. So Just Transition has got 3 pillars. We talk about this, again, Impact Task Force report that I'm mentioning here or putting on the slide, mobilizing institutional capital towards SDGs and a just transition. And the pillars are really important because they are around social impact and environmental impact. And the 3 pillars are climate, environmental action, socioeconomic distribution and equity, making sure there's opportunities for communities, very relevant for SARCC. And then what is the community ownership or the voice to make sure that they're representative, has to be owned by the local community. So I'm going to say something, I'm really happy that I've followed Mikhail because he's talked about a lot more detail about COP27, but the key message is there's a lot of pledges and not enough action. And there's not nearly enough capital to be able to fund the projects, particularly in the Global South. So looking into the gap, actually what the financial gap is, here's a report, the finance gap for UK nature. And if you look in that report, you look and see that against the UK's 25-year environmental plan, which many of the people in the room will be familiar with, those of us who work in the nonprofit sector, our work is very much geared towards those objectives in one way or the other, whether it's clean water, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's access to nature. And there's a 56 billion funding gap over 10 years. That's a lot of money. So I'm going to talk about blended finance, which is fundamentally partners who've got private, public sector funding, nonprofit foundations getting together to a program that have common outcomes, that are impact incomes to help fund against SDGs. This is another just example of what the map is of what impact investing is. And it ranges anywhere from, I want to help tackle climate change, I want to make sure I don't do any damage, I've got to do this because I'm regulated and therefore I have to. But the bottom line is this isn't about a quick return on investment, this is an investment. The point is that there has to be an investment or return on investment model. This isn't a grant-funded model, not in its full extent. So something that some of you may be familiar with is the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund. And these are 77 nature recovery projects that have received up to £100,000 each to get ready for private sector investment. There's some of us in the room, or at least are going to be online, some who've been successful in getting these and some who have not. And there's really great lessons learned because this is really a test bed for the Environment Agency and the other partners in the NERF fund to actually see what kinds of nature-based solution projects are ready to be invested in from that financial services ecosystem. And then on the right, I have examples of these NERF projects, which are very relevant to us here today: flood resilience, all the way to water quality, carbon sequestration, and also in many cases, the proposed were to be funded by green bonds. I won't go into a lot of detail, but effectively, the frustration is, well, I've got this project, I need the funding, why can't you just fund me? You know, what are all these different steps? Who are the parties? So this gives a bit of a flavor, is that the green bond is the special purpose vehicle where the investors can invest in one big project, mentioned like Tideway on the Thames Estuary, or it's a series of projects that have common themes. The investment readiness project has various stages, anywhere from having to technically prove all the way to capital investment. And so this has all the things that we're all familiar with, which is environmental surveying, all the way to having a long-term maintenance plan for the habitat creation that's got to stick around. Someone has to own that. Someone has to be the steward of that for many years to come. So there's pieces of the puzzle of the investment model that are complicated, but it's quite interesting to be able to see how these models have actually come together. This is all a fairly new space. The problem is when an investor wants to see something that is secure and has a proven track record. So a lot of this is actually fairly new. And in terms of investor appetite, it's just worth looking at some of the different strands here, whether it's biodiversity net gain, whether it's place-based SUDs, catchment services, woodlands, or peatland restoration. And in any case, if you look at the curve, private our founders, our foundations, and public philanthropic money will fund the upfront. It hasn't been tested side of these models. When it comes to private sector, they very much want to see that there are revenue streams that are coming through. So the opportunity that I'll mention today is there is a big nature impact fund. It is a government grant, it is government funded, but it's backed by Finance Earth, which is a social enterprise, and Federated Hermes, which is a pension fund. And the opportunity is that they're looking to invest in nature-based solutions that are either assets, businesses being contractors and companies who actually shovel in the ground, have the materials to actually do habitat restoration, or other businesses in the marine and coastal space who grow food and clean water. And then they're also interested in seed funding for innovation for ideas that are not investment ready, but they're interesting, then they need to be explored. Not interesting, but actually essential. So challenges. So investors want to invest in your project. What happens next? Well, aligning partners and objectives and outputs is very difficult. If you've got a project that's underway, it might take 10, 15, 20 years for it to come into play. Like the SARCC project is on a long timeline. How do you engage with the investors who actually have set up their investment criteria in a slightly different way? You need to have an asset to sell. So the difference is grant funding is money up front. I've got objectives I have to meet for my funder that can be quite restrictive. It can be within the project restricted economy, but you must have a return on investment if you're going to talk to an investor. So they will be talking about your nature-based solutions as if they were assets. And the other thing is you must have stackable benefits that, again, will turn into a return on investment model. The other thing is it seems that when you have an urban condition and you have communities, it seems to be harder to invest. And I think we had an early panel discussion. I think it was you, John, who said that projects fail to scale. One of you said that. That was David, you said that. So the wonderful thing about all of our projects is they're individual, they're unique, they're different, they're based in a local geography, which is very distinctive. That's not something it can necessarily lends itself to an investment model. So the closer you get to an urban condition, the more difficult it is. For instance, you've got a lot of gray infrastructure that needs to be replaced by habitat restoration, and it gets harder and harder to be able to come up with an NBS. So I think there's a common thread between being able to replace or gray infrastructure with green infrastructure, but it gets much harder when you get closer to communities. And timing is never on our side as well. Policy, I won't go into a lot of detail because I'm running out of time, but there are some strange quirks within these models that have been created where you've got additionality where the areas that are protected, like the SSSIs and Ramsar sites, they don't qualify for some of the new legislation that has been put into place vis-a-vis the biodiversity net gain. But there are some other systems in the world, like in the US, where they do have wetland offsets. I can go into more detail about what those concepts mean in the panel discussion. And I just wanted to mention that it's very important for investors, particularly on the social impact side, that you're reaching communities that are disproportionately affected by climate change. You're making opportunities for your local community, and that's not necessarily a very easy thing to do on the ground. So being able to make sure that your community is very inclusive is something that's very important to funders, and you need to make sure that you're really designing that into your program. This is one that we're working on Thames Estuary Partnership, and I think Amy's going to talk more about that tomorrow. Another thing is you've got to be a collective. You have to be able to try to scale up. So, oops, sorry, I've missed one slide. There you go. So one of the projects we're working on at Thames Estuary Partnership, again, Amy's going to talk more about this tomorrow, is the Championing Coastal Collaboration, the 3 Cs. And I'm going to try to keep back to my slide. I don't know what's happening with that. Where we have to work as a collective. We can't work in our pockets. We need to be able to work as a collective and be able to create the investment opportunities at scale. So if you're interested in any of these things that you think after we have the panel discussion, please get in touch, and that's my email address. Thank you very much.